It was just after midnight on a crisp autumn evening near the Vermont-Quebec border. The headlights of a battered 18-wheeler cut through the mist, its trailer groaning under the weight of dozens of unmarked metal barrels. To a casual observer, it could have been carrying oil, chemicals, or bulk goods. But to the FBI surveillance team parked discreetly off the highway, this truck was no ordinary shipment. For weeks, whispers had been circulating in intelligence briefings. Something unusual was moving across the northern border, not narcotics, not weapons, not counterfeit cash. Instead, the chatter suggested food. But not just any food. Something so oddly specific that even hardened FBI agents had laughed when it was first raised: maple syrup. Yet there they were, staring at the very cargo they had been tipped off about. The agents allowed the truck to roll past before pulling out in a slow, calculated pursuit. Inside the cab, the driver drummed his fingers nervously against the steering wheel. His instructions had been clear: no stops, no deviations, and above all, no questions about what was inside those barrels. Still, unease prickled the back of his neck. He had been paid in cash, far more than a normal long-haul job, and told only that the barrels had to get to a warehouse in upstate New York before dawn. The convoy of black SUVs trailing him might have gone unnoticed if he hadn't checked his mirror one too many times. His knuckles tightened on the wheel. He pressed harder on the accelerator. That was the cue. Red and blue lights erupted across the quiet road, cutting through the darkness like a blade. The truck swerved, tires screeching against asphalt, before grinding to a halt on the shoulder. Agents swarmed forward, weapons drawn, barking commands as the driver raised trembling hands. Then came the moment of truth. One of the agents cut the lock on the trailer and swung open the heavy doors. Inside, stacked row upon row, were the mysterious barrels. A few men heaved one onto the ground and pried it open. The liquid inside shimmered golden under the flashlight beam. It was thick, sweet, unmistakable. Maple syrup, an agent muttered in disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me." The others chuckled nervously, but the laughter didn't last long. A quick inventory revealed dozens of barrels, each worth thousands on the legitimate market. Together, the cargo was valued at nearly $1 million, more than many cocaine seizures the team had handled. The strange reports weren't a joke after all. Someone was smuggling syrup like contraband. The driver, still sweating in the back of a patrol car, insisted he had no idea what he was hauling. But his logbook told another story: multiple undocumented trips across the border, each with vague drop-off locations. This wasn't a one-off job. It was a pipeline. The realization hit the lead agent hard. This wasn't quirky or comical. This was organized. For centuries, maple syrup had been Canada's sweet national treasure, a symbol of cultural pride and a staple on breakfast tables. But in the black market economy, it had become something else entirely: liquid gold. By weight, syrup was selling for more than crude oil. And just like oil, whoever controlled it could make, or lose, fortunes. The Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, often compared to a cartel, tightly regulated supply and price. That control created resentment, especially among smaller producers and distributors who wanted to bypass the rules. Some turned to illicit buyers. Others turned to outright theft. And now, here was the FBI, staring at the proof. Back at their field office, the agents pored over the evidence. Who had the power to steal and move syrup at this scale? Why was it being funneled into American warehouses? And who was buying it once it crossed the border? There was also the uncomfortable reality: food smuggling wasn't a priority for the Bureau. They were trained to hunt terrorists, mob bosses, and drug lords. How would Washington react when they filed a report saying their big bust of the week was pancake topping? The humor wasn't lost on anyone. One agent joked, "We'll be remembered as the breakfast squad." But as the team dug deeper, the laughter turned into unease. Because beneath the sticky surface, the case was beginning to smell like something darker. The next morning, Canadian authorities confirmed suspicions. The barrels seized matched serial numbers from a secure storage facility in Quebec, part of the global strategic maple syrup reserve. This was no ordinary warehouse. It was essentially Fort Knox for syrup, holding millions of pounds under lock and key to stabilize the market. And somehow, thieves had broken in, siphoned barrels, and replaced the contents with water. By the time inspectors noticed, thousands of barrels had been compromised. What the FBI caught at the border was just a fraction of the missing stockpile. This was no small theft. This was an industrial-scale heist. The headlines that followed were mocking at first. Sticky situation at the border. FBI catches breakfast bandits. Late-night comedians crack jokes about undercover pancake stings. But behind the laughter, the Bureau quietly escalated the investigation. Because one troubling fact lingered, the truck they stopped wasn't alone. Surveillance suggested multiple shipments had already crossed into the United States undetected. That meant the black market for syrup was thriving on American soil. Someone, somewhere, was making millions off this liquid gold. And if there was one thing the FBI knew, it was that where there was easy money, organized crime was never far behind. As the first chapter of the Great Maple Syrup Heist unfolded, the agents could hardly have imagined the scale of what they had stumbled upon. They thought they had seized stolen barrels. In truth, they had cracked open one of the most bizarre, lucrative, and controversial smuggling rings in modern history. The case would soon lead them down a trail of corrupt officials, mafia-linked distributors, and a web of deceit that blurred the line between legitimate trade and criminal enterprise. And while Canadians would remember it as a national scandal, the FBI's fingerprints would be all over the pursuit. In the words of one veteran investigator, it started with pancakes. It ended with politics, money, and crime families. And the sticky trail had only just begun. Long before the FBI pulled open that trailer on the Vermont border, the seeds of the Great Maple Syrup Heist had already been sown. To understand how barrels of syrup could become the target of an international smuggling ring, one must first understand just how precious that sticky liquid truly is. At first glance, maple syrup seems almost laughably ordinary. It is a breakfast condiment, something poured over pancakes and waffles, sold in cheerful bottles at roadside shops or supermarkets. But behind that golden sweetness lies an industry worth hundreds of millions, one that is regulated, protected, and, some would argue, manipulated with ruthless efficiency. The beating heart of that industry lies in Quebec, Canada. Producing nearly 3/4 of the world's maple syrup, the province doesn't just dominate the market, it is the market. And since the early 2000s, all of that syrup has flowed through one powerful organization, the Federation of Quebec Maple Syrup Producers, known simply as the Federation. The Federation was established with noble intentions. Like OPEC does with oil, the Federation sought to stabilize maple syrup production and pricing. In years when trees produced a bounty, syrup was stored in massive reserves to prevent prices from plummeting. In leaner years, syrup was released from those reserves to keep the market steady. But what began as a protective body soon developed the reputation of a cartel. Every farmer, no matter how small, was required to sell their syrup through the Federation. Those who refused faced fines, confiscation of product, and in some cases, lawsuits. Independent producers complained that their freedom was being stripped away. It's like trying to sell tomatoes and being told you can only sell them to one buyer, at one price, under their rules, one Quebec farmer once grumbled to reporters. Except in this case, the tomatoes are liquid gold. And liquid gold it was. By 2011, the price of syrup had climbed so high that, pound for pound, it was worth more than crude oil. A single barrel could fetch over $1,800 on the market. Stored by the hundreds of thousands in sprawling warehouses, the Federation's reserves were estimated to hold over $100 million worth of syrup at any given time. To the Federation, this was prudent market management. To critics, it was legalized monopoly. And to criminals, it was a jackpot waiting to be plundered. As syrup prices soared, resentment bubbled. Many smaller producers felt trapped. They saw their syrup seized if they dared sell outside Federation channels, and they bristled at the idea that an unelected body controlled their livelihoods. In hushed conversations at sugar shacks across Quebec, the same words were whispered: mafia. Not the mafia with guns and cigars, perhaps, but an economic mafia, one that wielded power through bureaucracy and enforcement. Farmers who resisted often found themselves buried in debt from legal fees, while compliant producers enjoyed steady, if modest, profits. The tension created fertile ground for rebellion. If syrup could fetch a higher price on the black market, why not sell a few barrels off the books? If the Federation held back reserves to manipulate prices, why not siphon some away to eager buyers in the United States? For every law meant to control the industry, loopholes sprouted like weeds. And through those loopholes, organized crime sniffed opportunity. The United States was a particularly tempting market. American distributors constantly sought cheaper syrup to undercut their competitors. Some knowingly turned a blind eye to suspicious suppliers, so long as the barrels kept arriving. For mob-connected distributors who had already perfected smuggling networks for alcohol, cigarettes, or counterfeit goods, maple syrup was simply another commodity, one with far less scrutiny. And so, the lines began to blur. Small-time farmers frustrated with Federation rules sold a little on the side. Criminal intermediaries offered cash with no questions asked. And gradually, entire shipments began vanishing from the Federation's reserve. But no one yet grasped the scale of what was happening. The warehouse that would become the epicenter of the heist was located in St. Louis de Blanford, a sleepy Quebec town with little to distinguish it. From the outside, the facility looked ordinary, a sprawling, windowless building surrounded by chain-link fences. Inside, however, lay one of the most valuable stockpiles in North America. Row after row of barrels filled with pure Quebec maple syrup stretched across the cavernous space, thousands upon thousands of them, glistening in their steel drums, each one carefully catalogued and sealed. It was supposed to be impregnable. And yet, it was precisely here that thieves saw their chance. The plan was as daring as it was simple: infiltrate the warehouse, remove syrup from barrels, replace it with water, and move the stolen liquid out through shadow networks of smugglers. Because the barrels were so numerous, and inspections so infrequent, no one would notice, at least not right away. And indeed, for months, no one did. Meanwhile, across the border, rumors began to swirl among U.S. food distributors. Mysterious sellers were offering Canadian maple syrup at cutthroat prices, no paperwork required. Some shipments arrived in mislabeled trucks. Others came through third-party brokers. But all of it had one thing in common: it was genuine Quebec syrup, and it was flowing fast. The Federation, unaware at first, eventually grew suspicious. Audits began revealing barrels filled not with syrup, but with water. The theft was staggering in scope, millions of pounds missing. By the time inspectors realized what had happened, the syrup had already been funneled into the United States, where FBI agents were just beginning to notice unusual movements across the border. The theft wasn't a prank or a one-off scam. It was an operation so vast it would eventually be called one of the largest agricultural crimes in modern history. For Canadians, the scandal would become a national embarrassment. For the FBI, it was an unexpected headache. They had stumbled into a black market network that touched everything from mom-and-pop sugar shacks to international organized crime. The Great Maple Syrup Heist wasn't just about sweet liquid in barrels. It was about power, money, resentment, and control. It was about a cartel that acted like an economic government, a group of criminals bold enough to defy it, and an American law enforcement agency dragged into a sticky mess they never anticipated. But if the Federation thought the theft was merely a nuisance, they were mistaken. What began as whispers of resentment was about to explode into a full-scale heist, one that would shock the world. And when the first arrests came, the story would spiral into corruption, scandal, and accusations that went far beyond stolen syrup. The Federation's warehouse in St. Louis de Blanford was supposed to be a fortress. Behind its steel doors sat the beating heart of Quebec's maple empire, thousands upon thousands of barrels, each one brimming with liquid gold. Together, they represented millions of dollars, wealth that was meant to stabilize the market, to be released only at the Federation's command. But under the surface of that quiet town, a plan was brewing. A plan that would transform an ordinary warehouse into the scene of one of the boldest agricultural crimes in history. It started with a key. The thieves were not masked intruders cutting fences under the cover of darkness. They were insiders, people who knew the rhythms of the Federation, who could walk through its doors without raising suspicion. One of them rented space inside the very warehouse where the syrup reserve was kept, storing his own legitimate barrels alongside the Federation stockpile. It was the perfect cover. By day, everything appeared normal. Trucks rolled in and out, paperwork was filed, workers checked labels. But by night, or in carefully chosen hours when inspectors weren't looking, an entirely different operation took place. Forklifts rumbled across the concrete floor, lifting the heavy barrels. Some were siphoned directly, sticky sweetness pouring into plastic containers as if it were crude oil. Others were swapped entirely, rolled out of the warehouse and replaced with empty shells or barrels filled with water. The audacity was astonishing. And it worked. At first, the theft was cautious. A few barrels here, a few there. Enough to test the waters, literally. When no one noticed, confidence grew. The thieves became bolder, extracting syrup by the ton. One recalled later in court testimony how surreal it felt. You open a barrel, and it's just sitting there, thousands of dollars inside. You take a sip, and it tastes like freedom. Soon, trucks laden with stolen syrup were slipping quietly into the night, bound for makeshift warehouses, clandestine bottling plants, and eager buyers across the border. And here was the genius: syrup is not like cash. Once it leaves its barrel, it's almost impossible to trace. A bottle of maple syrup looks like a bottle of maple syrup, no serial numbers, no distinguishing marks. By the time it reached a breakfast table in Boston or Chicago, there was no way to know whether it had been sold legally or stolen in one of the most audacious crimes of the decade. The scale ballooned. Over the course of months, the thieves siphoned off nearly 3,000 tons of syrup, worth more than $18 million at market prices. To put that into perspective, it was more than the value of some bank robberies, more than many jewel heists, more than entire drug busts that had made national headlines. And it was done not with guns or explosives, but with pumps, hoses, and forklifts. For the Federation, the first signs of trouble came almost by accident. Inspectors tapped a barrel during routine checks and were startled when it echoed hollowly. They opened it to find not golden syrup, but clear water sloshing inside. At first, they thought it was a mistake, maybe a mix-up with cleaning barrels. But when more were tested, panic set in. Dozens of barrels were wrong. Then hundreds. The syrup wasn't missing, it had been stolen. The Federation's executives were stunned. They had built their power on control, on the belief that nothing happened in Quebec's syrup industry without their knowledge. And yet, under their very noses, millions had been siphoned away. As the investigation widened, the story broke into the press. Canadians were at first incredulous. Maple syrup? How could something so quaint, so iconic, be the target of a heist? Newspapers ran cartoons of burglars in masks carrying dripping pancakes under their arms. But as the numbers came out, the laughter faded. This wasn't a prank. This was a crime of staggering proportions. The Great Maple Syrup Heist, as it came to be called, had cost producers tens of millions, shaken the Federation's authority, and exposed glaring weaknesses in how Canada protected one of its most valuable exports. And then came the twist that made it international. Some of the stolen barrels had already been traced, not within Quebec, but across the border. U.S. warehouses, distributors, and bottlers had been found handling syrup with no clear origin. Some claimed ignorance. Others were clearly complicit, buying syrup at suspiciously low prices with a wink and a handshake. Suddenly, what had begun as a Canadian scandal was spilling south. And when the FBI realized that stolen syrup was crossing state lines, the case transformed from a domestic embarrassment into an international pursuit. The mechanics of the smuggling were ingenious. Barrels were driven across rural backroads, hidden in plain sight among legitimate shipments. Shell companies were created to buy, sell, and repackage syrup, blending stolen product into the legitimate market until it was indistinguishable. One FBI agent later quipped, "We're used to following the money. This time, we had to follow the pancakes." But beneath the humor, there was unease. The logistics, the coordination, the sheer audacity, it all pointed to something larger than disgruntled farmers or opportunistic thieves. Someone with serious connections had organized this. Someone with ties to distribution networks, trucking routes, and buyers across borders. This wasn't just theft. It was organized crime. For months, investigators in Canada and the United States worked in parallel. Raids were conducted on suspicious warehouses. Trucks were intercepted. Suspects were brought in. Slowly, a picture began to emerge, a network of thieves, smugglers, and black market brokers who had treated maple syrup like narcotics, moving it through shadowy channels and laundering it into legitimate supply chains. But the deeper they dug, the stranger the picture became. Whispers circulated that not all of the syrup had been recovered. That some of it had been quietly folded back into the official reserves, with no paper trail, to avoid further embarrassment. If true, it meant that even the Federation itself might have benefited, however indirectly, from the theft. By the time the dust settled, over a dozen people would be arrested, charged, or implicated. But as shocking as the theft itself was, the trials that followed would reveal an even darker truth, that the Great Maple Syrup Heist was not just about stolen barrels. It was about corruption, power, and the uncomfortable possibility that some of those shouting loudest about justice had sticky hands themselves. And as the FBI began to probe deeper into the American end of the smuggling chain, they uncovered ties that stretched far beyond breakfast. What they found next would drag the investigation into the shadowy world of organized crime, and leave a stain on an industry that prided itself on purity. The FBI's Boston field office wasn't used to cases like this. Agents there spent their days tackling terrorism threats, cybercrime, and organized narcotics networks, not breakfast condiments. Yet after that late-night border stop in Vermont, they found themselves staring at a stack of seized barrels, the air around them thick with the smell of maple. The first question was simple: where was it all going? If syrup was being smuggled across the border in bulk, then someone on the American side was willing to buy it. And those buyers weren't small-town diners or boutique pancake houses. No, the quantities were far too vast. Whoever was on the other end had access to warehouses, trucking routes, and distribution channels capable of swallowing thousands of gallons without raising an eyebrow. That meant only one thing: organized food distribution. And in America, organized distribution was often run, or at least touched, by organized crime. The agents began tracing the syrup seized in Vermont. Some barrels had been relabeled, stamped with phony numbers to obscure their origin. Others were left bare, relying on the sheer anonymity of a steel drum to pass unnoticed. A few, however, still bore faint traces of the Federation's inventory markings. That was enough to prove what Canadian authorities already feared: the stolen syrup wasn't disappearing into black market kitchens. It was entering the legitimate food supply chain. In other words, Americans were already eating it. The Bureau scrambled to map out the logistics. The trail wound through upstate New York warehouses, into New Jersey distribution centers, and down the eastern seaboard. Shipments were often disguised as sweeteners, sugar products, or food commodities, vague terms that meant little to inspectors. One intercepted invoice listed the product simply as amber liquid. An agent scrawled in the margin, "Whiskey or syrup?" The joke masked a serious concern. If criminals could move syrup undetected, what else could they sneak into the U.S. under the same disguise? The food chain, it turned out, was as porous as any border. The deeper they dug, the clearer the pattern became. The syrup wasn't being handled by amateurs. It was moving through trucking companies with known mob connections, businesses that had been implicated before in cigarette smuggling, liquor runs, even heroin distribution. For decades, organized crime had its sticky fingers in the food trade. Honey laundering, counterfeit olive oil, mislabeled seafood, there was good money in controlling what people ate. Syrup was just the newest product in an old business model. One veteran FBI agent put it bluntly: if the mob can profit off sugar, they will. If they can profit off pancakes, they'll do that too. In a warehouse raid outside Albany, the FBI made a startling discovery. Dozens of barrels stacked in neat rows, hidden behind crates of legitimate food products. The paperwork listed them as imported sweetener. But when agents cracked open a drum, the sweet, unmistakable aroma filled the room. Another shipment, seized in New Jersey, revealed something even stranger. The syrup had already been rebottled, labeled as Canadian Pure Maple, and was ready to hit store shelves. The black market operation wasn't just smuggling syrup. It was laundering it, washing away its illicit origin until it was indistinguishable from legal product. By the time it reached consumers, it carried the stamp of legitimacy. And that meant someone, somewhere, was making a fortune. But who? The Bureau's wiretaps and informants began pointing to names already familiar in other investigations: truckers with mob ties in New England, distributors suspected of laundering counterfeit liquor, even middlemen with links to Montreal's underworld. A chilling possibility emerged: the Great Maple Syrup Heist wasn't just the work of disgruntled farmers and opportunistic thieves. It was being propped up, expanded, and exploited by organized crime on both sides of the border. The Canadian thieves had provided the product. The American mobsters were handling the logistics. Together, they had created a cross-border black market empire, its currency as sweet as honey and as profitable as oil. As the FBI traced the sticky trail, public perception lagged behind. In the press, the case was still framed as an oddball Canadian story, quirky headlines about breakfast bandits and pancake protection squads. Comedians mocked it, calling it the silliest crime since someone tried to steal a bridge. But inside bureau offices, no one was laughing. The more the agents uncovered, the more sinister it became. Stolen syrup was tied to shell corporations registered offshore. Shipping documents suggested connections to companies in Florida, Chicago, even Los Angeles. The product wasn't just moving along the border, it was flowing into the veins of America's food system. And yet, every time the Bureau thought it was closing in, the trail slipped through their fingers. Warehouse managers claimed ignorance. Distributors insisted they had no idea the syrup was stolen. And buyers, when questioned, shrugged and pointed to paperwork that, on the surface, looked clean. The criminals had engineered the perfect crime, stealing something that, once sold, was impossible to distinguish from the legitimate product. One particular lead gave the investigation new urgency. An informant in New Jersey whispered that certain businessmen were using syrup shipments to cover for more traditional contraband. In other words, the barrels were a front. If true, it meant syrup smuggling wasn't just about breakfast, it was a smokescreen for drugs, cash, maybe even weapons. Suddenly, the jokes about pancake busts didn't seem so funny. The Bureau doubled down. Surveillance teams tracked trucks leaving rural Quebec, slipping across the border at odd hours. Wiretaps captured coded conversations, with men referring to sweets and liquid shipments. Agents began calling it the sticky trail, a breadcrumb path of syrup that stretched deeper and deeper into the American underworld. And behind it all loomed an uncomfortable question: how much did Canadian officials know? Some FBI agents suspected that the Federation itself, embarrassed by its vulnerability, wasn't telling the full truth. Rumors swirled that recovered barrels were quietly folded back into official reserves without proper documentation, masking the true scale of the theft. If accurate, it meant Canada's syrup cartel might have been complicit in covering up the very crime it claimed to want solved. By the time the Bureau briefed Washington, the case had morphed from quirky to critical. This isn't about pancakes anymore, one report concluded. This is about organized smuggling, cross-border laundering, and potential corruption in Canada's most protected industry. The Great Maple Syrup Heist may prove to be one of the most sophisticated food trafficking operations of the last decade. The sticky trail was no longer just leading south. It was winding straight into the shadows of organized crime, and perhaps even into the halls of power. And the FBI, reluctantly but determinedly, was in the chase. By the winter after the heist, the FBI had stopped laughing about maple syrup. The files piled on their desks painted a picture far stranger, and far more dangerous, than anyone could have imagined when that first truck was stopped in Vermont. The sticky trail of barrels, invoices, and whispered deals was no longer a quirky side project. It was a full-blown organized crime case. The Bureau had seen it before, though never quite like this. The Mafia had long understood the profit in controlling food. In the 20th century, mobsters had infiltrated everything from produce markets to meatpacking plants. Trucking routes, warehouses, and docks gave them chokeholds over what landed on dinner plates. Food was dependable, profitable, and far less risky than narcotics. And now, maple syrup was the perfect commodity. It was legal, it was valuable, and it was virtually untraceable once bottled. A barrel stolen in Quebec could be laundered into the American market within days. All it needed was a middleman to blur the paper trail, and suddenly it was indistinguishable from the syrup poured on a child's pancakes in Ohio or a diner's waffles in New Jersey. Wiretaps and surveillance revealed the truth: the syrup wasn't just passing through shady warehouses. It was moving along established mob routes. The same trucks that once ferried contraband cigarettes were now loaded with syrup. The same legitimate distribution companies that had been implicated in liquor scams were stamping invoices for sweetener imports. One informant told agents bluntly, "The mob doesn't care what's in the barrel. Could be booze, could be sugar, could be syrup. It's weight, it's profit, it's cash. That's all that matters. What chilled the FBI wasn't just the syrup, it was the pattern. The Bureau's organized crime units were already investigating counterfeit olive oil rings, honey laundering scams, and mislabeled seafood operations. Now maple syrup was part of the same ecosystem, a billion-dollar black market in food. The honey case was particularly instructive. Years earlier, federal investigators had uncovered Honeygate, where Chinese honey was funneled through fake distributors to avoid tariffs. The honey was relabeled, repackaged, and sold as premium product in the U.S. The profits were astronomical. Olive oil fraud was another. Investigators discovered that bottles labeled as extra virgin often contained cheap blends, swapped at some point in the chain by unscrupulous distributors. Consumers paid premium prices, while criminals pocketed the difference. Syrup fit right in. It was rare, it was expensive, and it was beloved. People didn't ask too many questions about its origin. One FBI analyst dryly summed it up in a briefing: organized crime has a sweet tooth. And syrup is the new sugar. As the Bureau mapped out the network, a troubling picture emerged. Certain American families with known mafia lineage had quietly extended their grip into the food sector. Trucking companies with mob histories were now thriving in legitimate distribution, their revenues mysteriously spiking after the heist. But the Canadians weren't off the hook either. In Montreal, whispers suggested that biker gangs and mafia-linked businessmen had offered protection to those moving syrup south. Quebec's underworld had long dabbled in contraband cigarettes. Syrup was simply the next profitable step. The FBI realized they weren't just dealing with quirky smugglers. They were staring at a transnational web of organized crime, stretching from sugar shacks in Quebec to mafia families in New Jersey, with trucks rolling between them like veins pumping golden liquid across the border. And then came the whispers of violence. At first, the syrup case had seemed non-violent, almost comical compared to drug busts or arms trafficking. But as pressure mounted, threats began surfacing. Warehouse owners who asked too many questions received anonymous phone calls. Truckers were warned to keep quiet. One Canadian middleman told investigators he feared for his life if he testified. This was no longer about barrels of syrup. It was about criminal power. Publicly, Canadian officials framed the theft as a simple heist, an embarrassment for the Federation but nothing more sinister. Privately, the FBI was less convinced. Reports suggested that some of the stolen syrup had been quietly reabsorbed into the official reserves, without full accounting. Was it incompetence, or was the Federation trying to cover its tracks? The Bureau's Canadian counterparts were cooperative, but something always seemed withheld. Files arrived redacted. Leads vanished into bureaucratic fog. The Federation itself lobbied aggressively to downplay the organized crime angle, insisting the thieves were rogue farmers, not mob-backed smugglers. The FBI wasn't buying it. One memo circulated among agents bore a scrawled note in the margin: who's protecting whom? By now, the public fascination with the syrup heist was at its peak. Journalists filled columns with colorful language: sticky-fingered thieves, liquid gold bandits, pancake pirates. Late-night hosts cracked jokes about FBI agents running stakeouts at IHOP. But for the Bureau, the humor was a thin mask. Behind closed doors, they were staring at a scandal. A national industry, Canada's pride, had been infiltrated by criminals, and its stolen product was flowing into the United States with the help of mafia-linked distributors. The controversy deepened when whispers reached investigators that certain U.S. buyers weren't merely ignorant, they were complicit. Distributors in New York and New Jersey allegedly knew full well that the syrup was stolen. They bought it anyway, calculating that the profits outweighed the risk. One internal report warned that American companies might have laundered millions of dollars worth of stolen syrup directly into the U.S. food system. That revelation, if made public, would not only embarrass Canada but also humiliate American regulators. The FBI now had two enemies: the criminals running the smuggling networks, and the bureaucrats desperate to keep the scandal quiet. It was a familiar bind, truth versus politics. And it wouldn't be the last time the Bureau faced resistance from the very institutions it was supposed to assist. As one weary agent muttered after a long night of stakeouts, "We thought this was a syrup case. Turns out, it's about corruption, cover-ups, and crime families. The pancakes are the least of it." By the spring, the Bureau was preparing to strike. Coordinated raids, sealed indictments, international warrants, they were ready to blow the lid off the sweet empire. But what they didn't realize was that the Federation in Quebec was mounting a strike of its own. Angry, humiliated, and desperate to save face, the cartel-like body of maple syrup producers was about to unleash its influence in ways that would shock even seasoned investigators. The syrup war was about to turn political. In Montreal's business district, tucked away in an office suite that looked more like a bank vault than a trade association, the Fédération de producteurs acéricoles du Québec, the Maple Syrup Federation, called an emergency meeting. On the agenda was not flavor profiles, not harvest forecasts, not even global syrup prices. The topic was war. For decades, the Federation had been more than an industry group. It was a cartel. It dictated quotas, set prices, and punished dissenting farmers who tried to sell outside its channels. In Quebec, maple syrup was as controlled as diamonds in Africa or oil in OPEC. Farmers might tap the trees, but the Federation controlled the flow. And now, their power was under threat. The Great Maple Syrup Heist had not only embarrassed them, it had exposed their grip to the world. For years, critics had accused the Federation of acting like a mafia, but suddenly, thanks to international press, the comparison stuck. Worse, the FBI was circling. If the Americans uncovered too much, the Federation's carefully maintained illusion of benevolent oversight could collapse. The Federation's response was swift and brutal. First came the spin. Their spokespeople flooded Canadian media with carefully crafted talking points. The thieves were rogue farmers. The stolen syrup represented a tiny fraction of reserves. The Federation was working hand in hand with law enforcement. Behind closed doors, however, executives were furious. Some demanded that farmers suspected of leaking information be blacklisted from selling syrup. Others whispered about cutting quiet deals to buy back stolen barrels before the FBI could track them. And in hushed conversations, one controversial proposal surfaced, leaning on their political connections to limit what the Americans were allowed to see. Here is where the story takes its scandalous twist. The FBI had assumed they were collaborating with Canadian authorities against criminals. What they did not realize was that powerful politicians in Quebec, some with campaign donations linked to the Federation, were more interested in protecting the syrup cartel than in solving the crime. Diplomatic cables later revealed the tension. FBI officials requested access to shipment records from Canadian Customs. The request was delayed. They asked for interviews with key Federation executives. The request was under review. Files that should have been transparent were suddenly classified as sensitive economic data. It didn't take long for Bureau analysts to notice a pattern. Whenever the investigation veered too close to the Federation's financial practices, Canadian cooperation dried up. Meanwhile, back in the United States, the Bureau faced its own headaches. Powerful food distributors, some suspected of knowingly buying stolen syrup, had lobbyists in Washington. One congressional aide, when briefed on the case, reportedly laughed. "You want us to spend political capital on maple syrup? Come on. The Federation has half of Quebec's politicians in its pocket. You think we'll risk a trade dispute over pancakes?" But this was no joke to the agents who had spent months mapping the smuggling routes. They knew that behind the sweet image of sugar shacks and family farms lurked an industry behaving like a multinational cartel. The Federation's most aggressive move, however, was against their own farmers. Any producer suspected of aiding the smugglers was slapped with crushing fines. Farmers who spoke to the press about Federation corruption suddenly found their syrup shipments delayed or their quotas reduced. One whistleblower even claimed his trees were vandalized after he criticized the Federation on local radio. "They make the mafia look polite," he told reporters. "At least the mob doesn't pretend to be your friend." Stories like his began trickling into the American press. For the first time, U.S. audiences saw maple syrup not as a quaint Canadian export but as a battleground of greed and intimidation. The FBI sensed an opportunity. Internally, Bureau strategists realized that the Federation's heavy-handed tactics could backfire. If the public came to view syrup as a rigged industry, support for a deeper investigation might grow. So, they leaked. Selective details about the smuggling operation, the mob connections, and the Federation's iron grip began appearing in American newspapers. None of it was official, but the message was clear. This wasn't just about stolen barrels, it was about corruption at the heart of Canada's sweetest industry. The Federation's leadership was livid. But rather than retreat, they doubled down. One scandalous revelation shook both countries. In a private email obtained by investigators, a Federation executive appeared to suggest that maintaining stability was more important than punishing every criminal. He wrote, "If the Americans dig too deep, they'll see things they should not. Better a few scapegoats than the entire industry on trial." When the email surfaced in FBI files, agents were stunned. This wasn't law enforcement, they were dealing with a cartel willing to sacrifice small-time thieves while shielding the larger machine. The Bureau's internal note summed it up bluntly. Federation equals gatekeepers. They decide what we see. But the Federation had underestimated the FBI's patience. Agents began bypassing Canadian bureaucrats, cultivating direct informants inside the smuggling network. Truckers, warehouse clerks, even a few disillusioned farmers agreed to cooperate in exchange for protection. Piece by piece, the Bureau was reconstructing the hidden economy. Every bribe, every payoff, every barrel. And then, just as indictments were being drafted, something shocking happened. A senior Canadian law enforcement officer, long thought to be an ally of the investigation, suddenly resigned. Whispers spread that he had been pressured by political leaders furious over his cooperation with the FBI. Some even claimed he had been offered a lucrative post within the Federation itself. It was the scandal that confirmed the FBI's darkest suspicions. This wasn't just about crime, it was about collusion. By now, the investigation had taken on a dangerous flavor. It was no longer about syrup thieves hiding in warehouses. It was about whether the Federation itself was functioning as a state-protected cartel. One exhausted FBI agent told a journalist off the record, "We set out to find barrels of syrup. Instead, we found a shadow government." And as rumors of indictments spread, the Federation prepared its counterattack. They had influence, they had money, and they had no intention of letting their empire collapse over a few sticky barrels. The war was about to reach a fever pitch. When the first sealed indictments were prepared, the FBI thought the case was finally reaching its climax. Months of surveillance, wiretaps, and painstaking financial tracing had built a compelling narrative, a network of smugglers tied to organized crime, a Federation desperate to control the story, and politicians willing to look the other way. But just as the hammer was about to fall, the machine of secrecy began to churn. The first blow came quietly. A low-level whistleblower, a Quebec customs officer who had leaked shipment records to the Bureau, suddenly went missing. His car was found abandoned near the St. Lawrence River. His wallet and ID were still inside. Canadian police called it a personal matter. The FBI called it intimidation. Then, 2 American agents working the case were abruptly reassigned to unrelated financial crimes. Officially, it was a routine rotation. Unofficially, everyone in the field office knew pressure had been applied from above. It felt less like an investigation, more like quicksand. The harder they pushed, the deeper they sank. Journalists began receiving anonymous warnings. A reporter from a major U.S. paper who pursued the syrup story was told in a late-night phone call, "You don't want to ruin your career over pancakes." She wrote the story anyway, but her editors, under sudden legal pressure, buried it. The public still thought the syrup heist was a quirky curiosity. But behind closed doors, it was a political landmine. Inside FBI headquarters, a heated debate erupted. One camp argued that the Bureau had to push forward no matter the resistance. "If we back down," one agent said, "we're letting a foreign cartel decide what American law enforcement can or cannot touch." The other camp warned of the fallout. International investigations were delicate. Without Canadian cooperation, the entire case risked collapsing. Worse, any public exposure of the Federation's alleged collusion could trigger a diplomatic crisis. And so, the cover-up began to take shape, not as a single order, but as a quiet suffocation. Leads weren't followed. Files were locked. Indictments were stalled. Meanwhile, in Quebec, the Federation was playing its own game. They offered token cooperation, handing over a handful of small-time farmers and warehouse guards as sacrificial lambs. Courts paraded them as masterminds of the heist, though insiders knew they were pawns at best. The message was clear: the Federation would give the public a story of justice, but not the truth. But not everyone inside the Federation was loyal. One of the most shocking twists came from within their own ranks. A mid-level accountant, frustrated by what he saw as systemic corruption, began feeding the FBI financial documents. The ledgers showed suspicious stability payments to politicians, unexplained transport fees to companies linked to known mob families, and enormous discrepancies in syrup inventory. The documents were dynamite. But before they could be entered into evidence, the accountant was exposed. He was fired, sued, and publicly discredited as a disgruntled employee. His life unraveled overnight. The Bureau realized that the Federation's grip was not just economic, it was reputational. Anyone who opposed them was destroyed. Even within American institutions, cracks formed. Some Bureau officials, under pressure from trade negotiators, argued that pursuing the Federation too aggressively could jeopardize U.S.-Canada relations. "It's not worth risking NAFTA over syrup," one official reportedly said in a closed-door meeting. That remark infuriated field agents who had risked their lives infiltrating smuggling networks. To them, it wasn't about trade, it was about principle. Organized crime was organized crime, whether it dealt in narcotics, weapons, or liquid gold. But principle rarely wins against politics. The turning point came when a sealed FBI memo was leaked to the Canadian press. It accused unnamed Federation executives of obstructing justice and hinted at high-level political interference. The leak caused a media firestorm. Suddenly, the syrup scandal was no longer a quirky headline. It was a full-blown controversy. Opposition politicians in Quebec demanded inquiries. Farmers protested outside Federation offices. The Canadian public, long suspicious of the Federation's iron grip, finally had proof of what many had whispered for years. But the backlash didn't just hit Canada. In Washington, furious diplomats accused the Bureau of destabilizing an ally. Agents were warned to keep their mouths shut. Behind the scenes, the FBI pressed forward with one last gambit. Using the accountant's documents, they traced a money trail from Federation accounts to a New Jersey distributor already under investigation for mob ties. It was the smoking gun, proof that stolen syrup had been knowingly laundered into the American food chain. But then came the scandal. The case against the distributor collapsed in court after a key piece of evidence was ruled inadmissible. Rumors swirled that political pressure had influenced the judge's decision. The FBI's star witness recanted under what agents suspected was intimidation. The trial ended in embarrassment. For the Bureau, it was clear, someone wanted this case buried. In one of the final field reports before the unit was dissolved, an FBI supervisor wrote a chilling line. "This investigation has been compromised at the highest levels. Our adversaries are not only criminals, they are institutions." The syrup heist had begun as a bizarre theft of barrels. It had evolved into a battle against corruption, collusion, and cover-ups. And while the public chuckled about pancake jokes, the agents who lived the case felt only bitterness. One agent, speaking anonymously years later, summed it up. "We weren't chasing thieves. We were chasing shadows. And the shadows won." But the story wasn't finished. For while the FBI case files gathered dust, rumors swirled of new smuggling rings, new buyers, and new connections stretching even deeper into politics. And as whispers grew louder, a final question hung in the air. If maple syrup could be corrupted, controlled, and covered up at this scale, what else was happening in the food on our tables? The FBI case files now sat in locked cabinets, gathering dust. Officially, the Great Maple Syrup Heist was over. A handful of Canadian farmers had been convicted. A few smugglers had pled guilty. Barrels had been recovered, losses written off, reputations patched with polished press releases. But anyone close to the case knew the truth, this wasn't justice. It was theater. And like any good theater, the actors weren't the ones in power, the directors behind the curtain were. In Quebec, the Federation emerged scarred but alive. They tightened their grip even further, rewriting contracts to ensure farmers could never sell outside official channels. Critics were branded as traitors to the industry. Those who had once dared to speak of corruption fell silent, many ruined by lawsuits or debt. Politicians who had been embarrassed by the FBI's leaks denounced the Bureau as meddling outsiders. A few even argued that America had tried to weaponize the syrup scandal to undermine Quebec's sovereignty. In private, though, they continued to cash the Federation's checks. The message was chillingly clear: syrup was not just breakfast, it was politics. For the FBI agents who had risked their careers chasing the sticky trail, the ending was bitter. Some transferred to new units, their work unacknowledged. Others quietly retired, muttering that the Bureau had bowed to pressure. One veteran agent, speaking years later to a documentary crew, summed it up with acid in his voice. "We thought we were fighting criminals. Turns out, we were fighting governments, industries, and mobsters all rolled into one. You can't win against that, not unless you're willing to burn everything down." Yet the syrup story refused to die. Investigative journalists, sniffing blood, kept digging. They unearthed new reports of counterfeit syrup entering the European market, suspected to be tied to the same smuggling rings the FBI had once tracked. Rumors spread of quiet settlements between American distributors and Canadian suppliers, hush money disguised as trade agreements. And then came the most explosive twist of all. A whistleblower inside the Canadian government leaked a cache of internal memos. One memo described meetings between Federation executives and provincial ministers, where they allegedly agreed to suppress damaging evidence to protect the industry's international image. Another suggested that American officials were privately warned not to embarrass an ally with further prosecutions. Most damning of all, one email implied that stolen syrup had been knowingly resold back into the official reserves, meaning consumers across North America may have eaten the very barrels at the heart of the heist. If true, it meant the Federation had literally laundered stolen goods into its own supply. The scandal exploded online. Hashtags like #SyrupGate and #StickyCoverUp trended across Twitter. Conspiracy forums lit up with theories. Was the Federation untouchable because of political donors? Was the FBI ordered to stand down? Was food fraud bigger than anyone dared admit? Public trust, once sweet and unquestioning, soured. For the first time, everyday consumers began asking hard questions about their food. If syrup could be stolen, laundered, and protected by politicians, what about honey? Olive oil? Seafood? Was the dinner table itself one vast crime scene? Meanwhile, the Federation scrambled. They launched glossy ad campaigns showing smiling farmers and golden syrup pouring over pancakes. They called critics alarmists. They funded research touting maple syrup as a national treasure. But behind the PR, cracks spread. Farmers whispered of revolts. A black market still thrived in shadowy corners, beyond the Federation's control. And international regulators, spurred by public outrage, quietly began probing whether Canada's syrup industry had grown too powerful, too insulated, too cartel-like. And the FBI? Officially, they washed their hands of the case. The files remained sealed, the failures unspoken. But off the record, some agents admitted they still followed the whispers. One claimed that maple syrup wasn't just a Canadian cartel problem anymore, it had become a global black market commodity, traded like diamonds, shielded like oil. What started in Quebec, he said, is just the tip of the iceberg. Food crime is the new frontier. Syrup was our warning shot. In the end, there was no Hollywood justice. No final raid that toppled the Federation. No courtroom showdown exposing corrupt politicians. Instead, there was silence. Sweet, sticky silence, paid for with ruined reputations, buried files, and forgotten barrels. But silence can be deafening. Because the Great Maple Syrup Heist left behind a legacy darker than stolen barrels. It revealed the uncomfortable truth that our food supply, what we eat, what we trust, is not immune to corruption. That behind every label and barcode may lurk a cartel, a crime family, or a politician willing to sell integrity for profit. And so, the story ends not with syrup dripping over pancakes, but with a question. When the FBI traced stolen syrup across borders, they pulled back the curtain on something bigger than breakfast. Something most of us would rather not see. The question is not whether justice was served. The question is, what else is being covered up? Because if maple syrup, the most innocent, wholesome symbol of Canada, can be corrupted, controlled, and covered up at this scale, then maybe nothing on your plate is safe.